You're listening to Inside the War Room, Case Studies in Crisis. Join us as we explore true stories and reveal new insights with our guests, key figures in some of the largest and most complex events of our time. In this episode,
people thought he had murdered an intern, a young woman with tremendous promise who just disappeared, right?
Exactly. I mean, as I said to you before, we talked about some other clients who were charged. Congressman Condit was never charged, but he was convicted and sentenced in the court of public opinion. A promising political career for people in his constituency in Northern California was ended. The tumult to his family was severe. No doubt somebody who wanted to spend his life in public service had to now find a private sector career. And I suspect if you spoke to him today, he would still say that he was having the effect of all that had happened 20 years ago.
And now, it's time to go inside the war room with your hosts, Shireen Abadi, Michael Estevez, and Jordan Strauss.
I'm Shireen Abadi, and I'm here with our co-hosts, Michael Estevez and Jordan Strauss. In this episode, Jordan speaks with renowned criminal defense attorney Abbe Lowell, partner at the law firm Winston Strawn. Abbe has successfully proven the innocence of countless high-profile defendants, including sitting and former U.S. senators, vice presidential candidates, and in one extraordinary case, a sitting congressman who was the main suspect in a murder investigation. Michael, one of the things that struck me about this interview was when Abbe likened being a high-stakes lawyer to being a master chess player, managing multiple boards at once.
Yeah, it's a great visualization of the interplay between the law, politics, business, and the news media, and how they all affect one another. It's a point where CEOs, generals, counsel, and litigation attorneys who are listening are going to want to really pay attention, because Abbe goes into how making a move on the law chessboard can knock down a piece on the media chessboard, and so on.
It's such a great metaphor and so appropriate for anyone who finds themselves leading in a multidimensional crisis. Kind of along those same lines, later in the interview, Abbe very eloquently talks about how perception is almost greater than reality. Great leaders have to manage not only the facts of the crisis, but also how those facts are communicated.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting, Shireen. And, there's a point in this discussion of this very, very high-profile case when, it becomes clear that the media, the public, and probably law enforcement have become convinced that they found their man, they found the killer. And as history has proven, that was not true. And hearing Abbe talk about how he tried to move all of those institutions and all of those people off of what was a wrong view, and a view that allowed the actual killer to go free was both fascinating and really frustrating.
Absolutely. Well, we could probably talk about this all day, but how about we listen to what Mr. Lowell has to say?
Today on Inside the War Room, we have one of America's living legend criminal defense attorneys. Abbe Lowell of Winston Strawn has successfully proven the innocence of countless high-profile criminal defendants, amongst them sitting United States senators, former United States senators, and vice presidential candidates, and in one extraordinarily high-profile case, a then sitting member of the House of Representatives accused of a very heinous crime, which, as history has shown, he did not commit. Abbe, we're so grateful that you could join us today. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. I don't know what to say other than after that introduction, I probably should retire after we're done.
Abbe, our audience includes quite a few lawyers, obviously investigators and communications specialists. If you wouldn't mind, I think it'd be really terrific, especially for some of the young lawyers and law students who might be listening, if you might be willing to briefly share how you decided to become a lawyer and how you either planned to get into or stumbled into the extraordinary career that you've had.
Sure. I think there are like two different storylines as to why I ended up talking to you today as a lawyer. The not as serious one is because my parents, none of whom were lawyers, and my family had no lawyers, had a friend who was a lawyer. We called him uncle, even though he wasn't really an uncle in that generation. I think people respected friends by calling them that. And he was the only lawyer that I knew, and he would visit, and he was a terrific guy. He drove a wonderful car. It was one of those Cadillacs that had those holes on the side and fins. And he took me to Yankee games and gave me chocolate cigars. And it seemed to me, wow, if that's what lawyers do, I'm in. But the more accurate story is I grew up in an era where lawyers were in charge of the issues I cared about deeply. For whatever reason, I became involved in causes like the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement in the Vietnam War era. And the leaders were often trained as lawyers, and I met them. And it dawned on me that that was a background and an experience level that could allow people to kind of do social justice. And that's kind of where I started. And consequently, I went down the path. And the third reason, and this will resonate with everybody, I mean, partially you follow a path that's been put in your ears when you're young and people say. So if you're young and you've created this amazing design with your erector set and you know math, people say, you know, you ought to be an engineer. And if you are somebody who cares deeply about things that are around you in a medical world, people say you should be a doctor. And because I was both argumentative and opinionated from the time I opened my mouth, people would always say, you ought to be a lawyer. So all those things come together and you go, what am I going to be when I grow up? I know, I'll be a lawyer.
Abbe, you had some early experiences in your career in public service. Could you talk a little bit about those?
So I came out of law school, and different than many people in my class, I decided I wanted to go into government. I had been very active politically since the time that I was in junior high school. And so it was natural if I could be in a government agency. It was not an unlikely choice. So I left law school in New York and jumped into the Carter administration because I knew and was active in that campaign, and joined the Justice Department initially in the honors program, and then ended up kind of being discovered by political appointees of that administration. Ultimately, the person who was the head of the criminal division, who became the deputy attorney general, and ultimately the attorney general, Benjamin Civiletti, and along the way got me into his front office, in which I performed as one of his policy advisors. And then shortly after that, I decided I wanted to get some experience as on-the-ground lawyer, and I transferred over to the U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of Columbia to get some trial experience as a special assignment. And so all those kind of laid the foundation for what happened next. And what happened next is that after I left the government, I was looking for something to do, and I wasn't quite, ready for the long run that it takes to be in a large firm from the get-go. So I started a law firm with somebody I had met along the way, who was the general counsel to the House of Representatives. And his name was Stan Brand. And Stan and I talked, and at a much too early age, with not enough experience, we started our own law firm with the concept that he having come from the House and me having come from the executive branch, we would start a practice where we took advantage of our experience and our desires and try to work both for government when we could and against government often, and see if we could form a practice that had that as its basis. And right off the bat, two events occurred that made that happen. The first was the House of Representatives itself hired us to be their special counsel in doing an ethics investigation of a member of Congress, a sitting member of Congress, George Hansen from Idaho, who had been charged with various federal violations, and they needed to do an ethics review. So we became the lawyers looking into that. And then the second was the local municipalities and counties around Washington hired us to challenge the Federal Aviation Administration's having changed the flight paths at National Airport so that he got a little noise as opposed to some people getting a lot of noise, and we challenged that. And those two cases, right off the bat, both did what Stan and I wanted to do, interacting with government agencies, in some cases working for them, and in some cases working against them. And from the get-go, were high profile. I mean, from the beginning, these were matters which were being covered by media at the same time we were trying to thread our way through. And so there it goes. And I think you know the story that we started a law firm with no clients and from scratch. And it's great to say that it worked according to what we had planned. But as I tell lots of people, if the first two people who walked in the building were a husband and wife fighting, I'd be a divorce lawyer today because we had to make a living.
So I think you follow the dream of the typical honors program attorney, which is, have an incredible adventure in Washington, do good work with the Department of Justice, maybe get to see some interesting things and be in some interesting rooms. You decided to hang a shingle. I guess I have this vision of, kind of a dilapidated old F Street office. I'm sure it was a lot nicer than that. And you just kind of caught these two really high profile cases right off the bat, and those got you launched?
That's right. Look, everybody would like to say when they look back at her or his career, that it was completely planned from the beginning. It followed a formula. We were smart enough or hardworking enough. Everybody also understands that there's a degree of fortuity and good fortune and luck involved to being at a place where you could take advantage of an opportunity that comes its way. So it's not completely happenstantial, but it's not completely, this was a meritocracy route. So that's definitely what happened. And you're not far off, by the way. We started our law firm in a 6-story brownstone off of McPherson Square on 15th Street, when that wasn't the place it is now. And, it was dilapidated. It wasn't, but it wasn't what people think of when they think of Washington high-powered lawyers, for sure.
So I'm guessing that your ability to improvise, which I think we're going to talk about in a bit, in one of your higher profile cases, kind of came a little bit early then, just kind of taking whatever would come in and trying to get good results for your clients.
Well, improvising is a word that I would use, but I would also qualify it as follows. In Washington, and I'm sure other places, but in the niche practice that came to us right from the start, as we've already described a bit, our job was to juggle a variety of challenges. And as a lawyer, the first challenge, of course, has to be, what is the legal battleground? What is the legal contours? What are the law, statute, cases, precedents? You've got to be a lawyer first. But if you are involved in a practice that takes you either for or against the government, there's always going to be a political component. In the case having to do with the FAA, it became a cause célèbre in local elections. And therefore, the mayors or the county executives basically wanted to use the litigation for political purposes. And in the case with Congressman Hansen, who happened to be a Republican, it became one of the things that set the precedent for one party using ethics allegations against the other. So you immediately now are dealing with the law, and in this case, politics. And then on top of it, which has been the mainstay of things that I've had to deal with, you get the added challenge of it being something being covered, it being what we call, quote, high profile, end quote. So now you have, how does the media angle fit into it? And so you have improvisation, if you will, based not just on the fact that you can play in one of those forums, you have to play in all three. And I've always likened this practice, which I do, and there are others, I mean, I don't think I'm the only person who does it, the following way. I tell people that I am a very bad chess player. Why am I a bad chess player? Because I know where a pawn or rook or the queen go, but I can only think one or two moves ahead in chess. In litigation, because of time and experience, I can think more moves ahead. I think many moves ahead. But if you've ever seen a great chess player in the park, you'll see them play chess on multiple boards. They go from one board, and then they move over to the next, and then the next, and the next. Well, the practice that is developed that I and others do is like playing chess on multiple boards. But unlike the chess masters, when you move a piece on the first board, it could knock down a piece on the other. So you might be on the legal board and you decide to do something, but then it has an impact on that second board, which was the press, or the third board, which was the politics, or the fourth board, which might be the marketplace if you're doing somebody in business. And that's the, if you're saying improvising, that requires when you're going to be in this kind of a case.
Four-dimensional chess.
But four-dimensional chess with the oddity of the pieces knocking into each other, even if they're not on the plateau.
So, Abbe, you've went from this two-person shop, in the intervening decades, and now you're at one of the largest, most well-regarded firms in the world. In the intervening years, besides stepping foot back into government to, handle small matters like representing the House minority during the Clinton impeachment affair, and then handling some extremely high profile criminal matters, you did have one of the highest profile cases in recent history in the late 90s and early aughts. And that was the criminal allegations and criminal investigation involving the disappearance of a Capitol Hill intern named Chandra Levy. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got involved with that?
Yes, of course. So by the time of that event, and you're saying, of course, in the year 2000 is really when I guess all materialized, I had already served as counsel to members of Congress on an occasion in the ethics special case for Congress the impeachment of President Clinton. So that community knew me and I knew the community. Plus the other cases I've done, which basically were just, if you will, mainstream white collar and other criminal litigation matters. And so that was the background. That was the basis. So when Congressman Gary Condit became the focus of the disappearance of somebody he knew and who worked in his office, it was not a strange event that somebody in his world would connect with me or somebody in my world, and somebody would try to make that match. I mean, it wasn't probably, I know for a fact I wasn't the only person that was considered, but it was not crazy that, oh, if you need a criminal defense lawyer in Washington in a case that has law and politics and communications and PR and craziness, there is a list of people. And I surely at that point hoped that I was on the list. As it turns out, I was. So that's the background. And then people I had worked with in the leadership of Congress and those other events were very involved with him. And I think one of them talked to him and suggested that he and I have a conversation, and he or his chief of staff or person close to him initially reached out to me. And that's how the first event occurred. At that point, he had already become the focus of the media saying, wait, what was your involvement in this, if any? And of course, there weren't ever any charges either then or ever. So he never actually was charged except in the court of public opinion, where he was charged, convicted, and sentenced. But at that point, it was at the beginning, and it had just begun to reach the level of people pointing the finger at him.
So the scene is this. The economy is in a period of tremendous strength. There's relative peace at home and abroad, and there's very little of news interest in the DC area at the time. The country's just gone through the impeachment of Bill Clinton, which some would say was for having an affair with a young intern. Around the same time, more than one sitting congressman has to step down because of inappropriate relations with their staffers. In comes handsome, successful, rising star with great hair from California named Gary Condit. Also working in DC at the time is a young female intern from California. Her name's Chandra Levy. One day, Miss Levy disappeared. Almost immediately, accusations started swirling that Congressman Condit was involved. Before long, Condit was the primary person of interest in what turned out to be a murder investigation.
Abbe, I think we all know sometimes one of the challenges of being Abbe Lowell or being, I'm just trying to think of other lawyers, Edward Bennett Williams, or being affiliated with a particular kind of investigative or crisis management firm, is that the fact that someone might be meeting with you, the fact that someone's taking a meeting with Abbe Lowell could be interpreted in some quarters as not necessarily, certainly not an admission of guilt, but an understanding that the problem that they're having might be kind of serious. And I'm just out of professional curiosity, if you can talk about it, what kind of tradecraft might you use to, reduce the chances that it becomes well known that someone is meeting with you? And I know there's actually been some public reporting on this case. I'm kind of hoping maybe you can talk about that.
I can in that for sure. But let me start with the proposition that you said, which is true. I always find it is a little bit annoying, right? I mean, to be in the business of trying to get work for myself and the people who rely on me and to try to become involved in interesting things, you have this phenomenon where people say, and it's, again, this is not by any means unique to me, that sometimes when somebody says, oh, I'm in trouble, I know I need a lawyer, and then they go, okay, well, wait, if I talk to Sally Smith or John Doe or Abbe Lowell, isn't that a sign that I'm really in trouble or I really need help? Well, to start off with, I have developed a response when I hear that, and I do hear that more than I'd like to. And my response always goes like, okay, so you're walking down the street and you have this enormous pain in your chest, and it could either be the hot dog you had for lunch, or it could be that you're having a massive coronary. Do you go into a prompt care, or do you go to a doctor that can tell the difference to figure it out? And most people, when I say that, sort of get it. So hopefully they will continue. And somebody who's done some work isn't prejudiced by somebody thinking, well, I really need help. That being the case, in this particular case, as I said, so people in his world reached out to me and then said we should meet. And at that point, he was being trailed, I think already, almost 24/7. And he was very nervous, not just because it was me, I think, but everything he did, he wanted to make sure was not necessarily going to be the next news story. So those intermediaries and I figured out that we would meet, and I think he had an event, and the story is told that he and a staff person were in a car, one of the staff person's cars. We made a meeting point to meet. It was on the corner on Capitol Hill somewhere, and we did that, and the aide jumped out, and I jumped in, and that's how I had my first conversation with Congressman.
Now, on these first conversations, and I want to be very clear, not about Congressman Condit in particular, but how might a first meeting with Abbe Lowell go? I mean, you've got to be thinking about, how am I going to get information? How am I going to manage this? How am I going to get the correct version of the truth, which is presumably your client's version of the truth, out? I mean, what is the first discussion? Is it like going to a doctor? Like, let me tell you what's wrong?
It is. First of all, there's not a checklist. There's not a form. You don't get to have gone to law school or take your bar exam review course, and they give you a piece of paper and said, first you ask their name, and then you ask where they were born, and then you ask where they went to college. No, it's not like that. I mean, here's something that I've noticed that I don't think a lot of people get. I do a lot of work representing individuals, because if you want to be a criminal defense lawyer and you want to be a trial lawyer, you're mostly going to be involved with representing individuals than companies who tend not to go to trial in a criminal context, and maybe not even in a civil context anymore, or at least not very often. So that being the case, I've had the opportunity to deal with lots of individuals. And when you're a lawyer representing an individual in trouble, and whether it's a civil case or a criminal case, you become a lot of things to that person. First and foremost, you got to remember you are that person's lawyer. But those people are in a lot of stress and a lot of trouble internally and externally, and you become more than a lawyer. Sometimes you're their psychiatrist. Sometimes you're their marriage counselor. Sometimes you are their crutch or shoulder. Sometimes you're their empathetic ear. So you develop those skills, some better than others. I hope I've gotten better at it. I hope that that's the case. So the way you talk to people day one is making sure that you express to them that as best as you can, you understand what they're going through. Now, most lawyers can be within inches of their client's life. I stand next to the person I'm in court with. I sit next to them at a table, so I can get very close. But it's impossible for a lawyer to really sit in the shoes of somebody. But they need to understand that your experience level or what you've gotten to understand gets you as close as you possibly can be. So that's one feature. And the second feature might surprise people, because I even think that in those occasions in which I have spoken to people that are running companies, and it's the company under inquiry, the company being sued, the company that needs a lawyer, talking to a CEO or a high-level official often has the same dynamic. And people might be surprised about that, because they think, well, wait, why is that? It's a company. At the end of the day, companies don't go to jail, but companies go out of business. Companies lose their market value. People get fired from their positions of CEO. And so the stakes can be somewhat similar. But in that first conversation you have, mostly you ought to be in a listening mode. And even if people don't tell the story in an efficient way or in a linear way or in a way that basically makes sense, that first meeting is mostly a time for people to just dump out all that they want to say. And it's after that that you can sort it out and then become better at being probative and ask the right questions and ask them in the right order and figure out what's going on. So that's how a first meeting goes. And I think that's the same for every lawyer in the country, no matter whether you're dealing with an individual or an entity.
Now, I've got this mental image here, as I'm sure some of our listeners do. It's been publicly reported that you're in the back of I'm assuming like a Suburban or a Tahoe. And
actually, it was the passenger seat, because it was only the two of us, but keep going.
Okay. So, and you're trying to have that conversation. You're trying to put a client, presumably at ease, and again, being very careful about the privilege here. And presumably at some point, it becomes apparent that you're his man, right? He wants you in his corner. Is that right?
The way you put it sounds, I don't know, a little bit more dramatic or a little bit more, I don't know, exulting than it was. But so after the conversation, I'm sure he goes back and talks to his family or talks to his aides. I go back and ponder whether this is yet another thing that makes sense to be involved in. And within a short period of time, we come to an agreement that he would like me to advise and I would like to be the advisor. So yes, that's kind of how it goes.
Now, Abbe, this is another, I guess, personal question. we've all had the luck or the curse to work on some high profile matters, in government or out. What is the version of the Lowell household talk when you're about to undertake something like this? Like, look, kids, this is going to get a little bit rough. Don't talk to the media. Don't talk to your friends. Be discreet. You might see your dad on the news a little bit. Or is it just sort of understood?
No. So it's happened over time. It is a phenomenon in our society, which is, as everybody knows, probably at its most tense moments, divided, passionate, argumentative, basically zero-sum game where you're either, winning or losing and nobody compromises, that lawyers get to be in the fodder. I can tell lots of stories about the things that have been said to me directly and indirectly, and, the both good and ugliness of it. So in terms of family and friends, I think over time, especially in recent times, they understand that it's not like I or this practice is unique in America. It's just one of the things that's happening in America. So when I represented Congressman Condit, which was a very high profile in a summer with no other news going on in Washington, because it happened months before 9/11, and people needed something to report and talk about. And it was highly charged. I mean, there was a human being that was missing, and an angst family and an anguished family. And that's everything that everybody was talking about. And everybody thought, my gosh, what did this man do? That spills over. And so it has not been a rare occurrence, and I'm not trying to be heroic here, where the high emotions of people spill over against the lawyers. And in that particular case, I'm sad to report that I did get things ranging from mail or calls where people said things like, I hope what happens to Chandra Levy happens to your daughters. And, what do you do with that? You shake your head, you hope that people have just been mouthing off. On a few occasions in my life, I've had to seek a little bit of protection against people making threats, but it goes with the turf.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of a departure from kind of the Tocquevillian or Hamiltonian utopia that I think we started on this call about the role of the lawyer in society. I'm curious, Abbe, I want to get back to the representation of Congressman Condit, but do you think that that's something that's getting a little bit worse right now or a little bit better? Because it does seem increasingly, and look, we did just have an impeachment trial. It does seem like lawyers are increasingly in the crosshairs in the public space.
It has definitely gotten worse. And again, I think that's not leading the charge. Don't you think the public dialogue has gotten worse across the board? I think lawyers playing the role they do, being in the forefront, are not surprising targets for that. But I can tell you this. So I've represented a lot of people who are controversial and have been charged with things that, whether they violated the law or not, provoke great emotions in people. Former Senator and candidate John Edwards. You've talked about Gary Condit. In the last 2 years, I represented Senator Bob Menendez, who is a Democrat, and I've been an advisor to senior advisor at the White House, Jared Kushner. I cannot tell you that in those two representations, the amount of ugly and inappropriate comments that have been made and directed to me and directed to my family. It is something that is disappointing. And as I said, it's not surprising given the tone in America, but I do think it's gotten worse. And it's odd because people think that lawyers are the same as their clients. And when we do that, we basically should remember, and it's the much, by the way, misaligned phrase that everybody likes to remember in Shakespeare's Henry play, where it is said the first thing we do is kill the lawyers. People forget to note
chaos. Yeah.
People forget that it's the mob that says that. Yeah. And it's because Shakespeare, who I believe had a great fondness for lawyers, understood that without the legal structure, society could fall apart. But it has gotten worse. And, the good news is I think pendulum swings. I think it's so bad that I'm looking forward to the swing in the other direction.
Abbe, and you were able to prove the innocence or get I believe, a jury acquittal of Senator and Vice Presidential candidate and Presidential candidate Edwards. I can't recall if it was a full acquittal
They were both. They were in Senator Edwards. There was counts, and there was an acquittal, and then there were hang. And the hang, I think we remember after we got interviewed, was 11-1 for acquittal, and similar for Senator Menendez.
Mm-hmm. Again, just personal curiosity: did the intensity of politicized ire that your family was on the receiving end of, did that increase or decrease after those trials?
Well, I mean, I think the good news there is that people get all hot and bothered, and then something else makes them hot and bothered next week. And I or whoever they're hot and bothered about week one disappear in week 2 or 3. But what was interesting in that era was I was representing somebody very high profile on one side of the aisle, somebody very high profile on the other. And what was, I mean, if it wasn't serious, it would be more humorous, which was I was kind of getting equal opportunity hate mail. You know, I was getting Republicans that were yelling at me, how could I help this man who has so betrayed his constituents and the public trust in New Jersey? And a day later, I'd be getting something that said, I can't believe you would be a legal advisor to somebody in this administration, let alone somebody related to the president. And so there you go. I mean, in a certain way, it was nice to have both coming in because it basically represented what's wrong with the discourse as opposed to what's wrong with lawyers.
Now, Senator Menendez was reelected after the acquittal, and the Department of Justice ultimately walked away from any attempts to a retrial. Senator Edwards is, I believe, living a happy life doing public works. Congressman Condit was in the center of, I guess, public or media allegations involving something much more serious that I think resounded very differently with many Americans from campaign finance and other issues. People thought he had murdered an intern, a young woman with tremendous promise who just disappeared, right?
Exactly. I mean, as I said to you before, you know, we talked about some other clients who were charged. Congressman Condit was never charged, but he was convicted and sentenced in the court of public opinion. A promising political career for people in his constituency in Northern California was ended. The tumult to his family was severe. No doubt somebody who wanted to spend his life in public service had to now find a private sector career. And I suspect if you spoke to him today, he would still say that he was having the effect of all that had happened 20 years ago.
And, you know, we now know that he was in fact innocent.
Indeed.
Another individual who was prosecuted, convicted, and then ultimately released for reasons that I think still remain not entirely clear, was years later found to have been the murderer of Miss Levy, the intern.
I do think that if people were to think about it and study it, the investigation of the disappearance of Chandra Levy should be really instructive to everybody. It should be instructive to lawyers. I'll come back to that in a second. It should be instructive to journalists. It should be instructive to the law enforcement community. Because as the overly used phrase perfect storm has now been coined, it was a perfect storm of the failures of all the above. And the tragedy in it, the extraordinary tragedy, was that because of that perfect storm and the severe and inappropriate focus, laser beam focus on Congressman Condit, other leads were not pursued, other evidence was allowed to dissipate, and by the time they figured it out, it was too late, because when Ms. Levy was discovered, it had been so long afterwards, the forensic evidence was gone. The person who could have been linked was no longer able to be done so. The case had to depend on a jailhouse snitch, et cetera, et cetera. And remembering every hour of every day of every week of that relives the frustration I and those who were working on the case had in terms of trying to get the police and trying to get the media to understand not just that our client was not involved, but it meant that somebody else was involved and no one seemed to care.
So Congressman Condit retains Abbe Lowell. Abbe, what do the opening days of that retention look like? What is going on in the center of the storm?
So in the center of the storm during that period of time, a few things were going on. First, Congressman Condit had agreed to be interviewed by the police. One time, he was not represented when that happened. The people who were doing it, I don't think, were either thorough or particularly effective. And so there wasn't long after that the police and the others wanted a second interview, and that had to be dealt with. Second issue was that the media had now come to the point that you just said. It was the only news story in the United States. I mean, remember, we had gotten through the Bush-Gore election, but that had basically happened already, and now we were into the next year. And so there was nothing else going on in that summer, and the media had a great story, and a tragically great story. The third thing that was going on was, and I've said this before, so I'm not saying anything new, the police that were assigned to this were completely out of their depths. They were just unable to negotiate those factors, which is a high-profile investigation where the media is on their back every minute, where the family of Chandra Levy were appropriately vocal and public and visible and putting pressure on everybody every second of the day, as anybody who has a child would be. And on top of which, there was, as I said, this idea that this weird story about a congressman and a young woman being involved. And so if you take all that, it was our job immediately to do the following. First, we had to figure out what we understood the facts to be in the way you could do that, which includes, of course, talking to your own client and talking to the people around him. But we had a lot of media outlets that were doing a lot of investigation that we could use to understand what they were finding. Problem there was that, more than 50% of it was wrong, but still it allowed us to track down every lead. The next thing was to parry whatever the law enforcement community was doing in terms of figuring out how to deal with them and their requests for interviews and searches and DNA samples and whatever else law enforcement would do. And then the last element of it was to deal with the political, where, again, in the era we live, with no more than those allegations, members of the opposite party were demanding that Congressman Condit resign and leave his seat and, again, completely eviscerate the presumption of innocence that should exist in our country, let alone in the halls of the United States Congress. And all that gets sorted out into various buckets. So the lawyer part of this was to figure out how to get a second interview, because the last thing that he needed for all the above was to say he wasn't going to. Remember, public officials have a different scenario than private people often. A private person in that situation might have a lawyer who said, you're not going to open your mouth again. You're not going to have an interview. You're never going to submit yourself to anything voluntarily, because that's the right of Americans when they have the right under the Fifth Amendment and the Sixth Amendment, and the government has the burden of proof. Public officials and high-profile people don't have that option. And so it was not acceptable for him to say, I ain't talking again. We had to figure out a way to do it. We came up with some, I thought at the time, maybe not in the test of time, clever ways to get that done. So you have that going on. We had to figure out whether we were going to subject him to a search and subject him to DNA. Ultimately, I came up with this, what turns out to be, I thought at the time, smart people. It actually exacerbated my own war with the police when we did our own private polygraph. But you have the legal part, and then there was the media part. And as you know, I am very self-critical of the media part because I think I mishandled it badly.
Could we talk just about the communications piece of that for a moment?
Sure.
So you have a client who's, actually innocent. One of the most terrifying kinds of cases, not just because that your client may be accused of something that they didn't do, but because, as you noted earlier, in this case, the real killer is out there somewhere. So how do you handle communications there? And what do you feel like you did right?
So there had to be a communication strategy. He had to fend off people demanding his resignation. He had to respond to his constituents who naturally wanted to know what happened and what did you do? But at the same time, I don't think there had been a phenomenon like the Condit case at the time. There had never been something quite like this, at least in the modern era. And so you're trying to do your job as a lawyer. And the thing is, you can't have the congressman out there giving interviews over and over and over again, because that's going to interfere with your lawyerly part. He might not say it right. It might create more suspicion. It might create inconsistencies. So who's going to communicate and what is going to be communicated? And that's where you can fall into the abyss. I looked mightily to see if there was somebody on his staff who could become the spokesperson. But this wasn't about his officialdom. This wasn't whether he was taking a position on a tax bill. It was in his personal life, and it was inappropriate for the congressional staff to become his spokesperson. I tried to find a private person who could then become, if you will, the foil, the media person. And we did get some people, but nobody was very anxious to go be the public face because this was very hard. I'll give you an example. I mean, I could not leave my own office without there being no fewer than 20 or 25 reporters that followed me wherever I went. And he had stakeouts 24/7 at his apartment. It wasn't a mission that lots of people were aspiring to. And so we had to have a communication strategy. And sort of by default, I ended up doing more of that than in retrospect made sense. I tried to keep the lawyer part versus the communications part differently, but I did. And by the way, since then, you see a lot of lawyers do that. I mean, you don't have to go very far than cable news at night. And there's probably not a night where there's not a lawyer, either for her or his own case or being willing to comment on others, that doesn't mind pontificating. Well, I was pontificating to the extent I was about a specific client. And it turns out that I think a better choice would have been to insist that somebody else take that job because people could mistake the idea of being the lawyer to being the flack. But you do have to have a communication strategy because people are demanding that there are things being said. And so something had to be said, but how to say it and who to say it. So I ended up doing more of that in retrospect than I think I should have done. On the other hand, if I'm going to forgive myself, I'm going to forgive myself because it was like that famous line where you have a bunch of soldiers standing at attention in a line and the sergeant looks at them and says, "I need a volunteer. Will a volunteer step forward?" And everybody but one steps back. So that's how that happened. That's literally true.
Now, while the media affair is ongoing, there's a very serious, I hope, effort by the DC Police Department to conduct a real investigation. And that presumably is something that you need to be thinking about and managing, and you need to be finding your own facts as well, because again, you've got this innocent client and you're concerned he's going to be accused of something he didn't do and that the real killer is going to go free. So how do you do that if you're being followed 24/7, if your client's being staked out?
Well, to tell you some of the things we did, I mean, in retrospect, they seem sort of, I don't know, they're entertaining, I guess. So as I said to you, that he had already been interviewed without the world sort of knowing about it. And then there was the need to have a second interview. By the way, by the time it was done, we had 4 interviews, and that's a story into itself. The bottom line being each one, I basically was able to at least have law enforcement not go over the same ground necessarily. And the 4th interview was really the one that was conducted by the FBI more than the local police. And by then the FBI had come to the conclusion that he was not involved. And if you will, it was like a shut the case interview. But the second interview is a good example. So the way we did it is still, I cannot reveal the identity, but I arranged for a friend of mine to give me this friend's house in the Washington area to use as the place where I and the congressman would arrive. And then at a different time, the detectives would arrive and go through the side and figure out a way to avoid the press. And that's where the second interview was done. And the second thing that was done in terms of making sure that we could move on, look, everybody wanted to ask Congressman Condit only one question. The media, his constituents, the family, everybody, which was, what's the nature of your relationship with Miss Levy? With the idea that that would be somehow probative of whether he would murder her. It was kind of nuts. It was kind of actually counterintuitive. But having said that, I came up with this device. Again, in retrospect, it was imperfect. But it was, so we started the interview and I said to the detectives, let me start by telling you, I want you to assume for the purposes of this interview that he had the most intimate relationship with Ms. Levy that you could imagine. And now start asking your questions based on that premise. So he never had to confirm that and he never had to deny it. And it so took them off guard, it almost like they didn't know what to ask. But how I went about then was to try to get them to see the information. And what I did is what I told you. I had access to him, access to his staff. I had access to what the media was reporting. We had my own investigator and colleagues running around with leads and doing the best we could in a situation where the amount of facts. Remember, you're not talking about a complicated antitrust case. You're talking about a person who went missing, who had a certain kind of relationship with people and a certain geography and a certain motive and a certain lap motive. It wasn't like there were 11 moving gears. There were 3.
Mm-hmm. And, for those non-lawyers who are listening, the interview ground rule Right. Just make this assumption. First of all, just to be clear, it doesn't mean that there was or wasn't an intimate relationship, but I assume that means that was your way of just kind of moving the interviewers off of something that was irrelevant and into presumably probative and ultimately exculpatory investigating.
That was the idea. Look, if somebody was missing in somebody you knew and the police wanted to know, what would you ask? You'd ask, when did you last see the person? Where? Under what circumstances? Were you in any kind of argument with the person? Do you know anybody else that this person hangs out with? Et cetera, et cetera. That's the right question, right? The not right question is, okay, now tell me, the details of what kind of relationship with you had or a year ago or half a year ago or whatever. So what I tried to do is move beyond that. I think in that interview we did. And then it was weird because in the third interview, the only thing the police wanted to know was the answer to that question. And it didn't matter any other question. And so it got to be a tense moment. But the point is, to answer your question on the legal side, that's how one develops facts. But this was not hard to develop the facts that mattered. What was hard was to get the police to develop the facts that mattered. So I didn't have the problem. I think they did.
Yeah. And that issue persisted. Could you take us through what happened after the third interview with DCPD and the first interview with the FBI, which is the fourth interview, I think, total?
Well, I think along the way, there were a lot of things happening. They continued to have tunnel vision about Congressman Condit. So we went from interviews to whether they wanted to search his apartment. So I told them they didn't need a search warrant and we would agree. We tried, again, looking back, how humorous my attempt was, right? We did this search in the middle of the night, thinking that it wouldn't create media circus. And needless to say, it got leaked and the media was there in even more numbers. There came a point where they wanted a DNA sample. We did that in a parking lot, similar to the first interview, where I basically had a rendezvous and a swab ready to exchange that. And then I had arranged what I thought might change the dynamic by having the most well-known, experienced former FBI lie detector expert administer a private lie detector test to him. Did that at a different friend's house. I'm glad to report that both of those friends still remain anonymous and they still talk to me. And so we did that, and that came up as I expected it would, showing non-deception on any of the key issues. And all that was happening leading up to finally, long after it should have been, people at the federal level with a little bit more experience dealing with these kinds of cases taking over. And as I said, doing a last interview that was basically looking to see what he could tell them that had nothing to do with him. So that was the sequence of events as we were moving forward.
Can you take our listeners through how things tailed out?
So a couple of things happened towards the end of the summer. Things got more and more tense between the congressman, the police, people in politics, the media, and there were a few events that finally led to, if you will, the end game. One was, without any other leads and them not going anyplace else, the police one day contacted me and asked whether I would agree to, or at least make arrangements for, various staff members' cars to be searched, as if this nonsensical story that the congressman abducted Miss Levy and had his staff abduct and dispose of the body was true. At that point, look what we had been through. And I have to admit, in retrospect, I probably wasn't the most patient on that particular call with that particular police chief. And out of frustration, I simply said to him, I just cannot believe that this is what you're doing, as trying to find the person who really might be involved. And this has been reported by him. I said to him, if you have any time, why don't you send your police into the parks and see if you can't find any evidence of her there? Now, I had no reason to say that other than saying it. And as it turns out, tragically, of course, ultimately, like months and months and months later, that's where she was found. And that was one event, and they did end up searching the cars of one or two staff people. The second event, as I said, was I did this polygraph, and that should have ended the matter completely, but the police chief then accused me of showboating by having announced the results and basically demeaned this great FBI polygraph expert for no real good reason other than they were embarrassed. And then, of course, after he had done all these interviews and there were no leads and the trail had run dry, the tragic events of 9/11 occurred, and there was another story that was much more important than Congressman Condit. And that's how it ended, except for right before that, the congressman did agree to a nationally televised interview, which didn't do him any good, as it turned out.
Let me ask you, with the benefit of hindsight, what, if anything, do you think you could have done differently or could have been done differently? I mean, is there any way that Congressman Condit could have been spared this level of scrutiny or the impacts on him, his family, and his career?
It's so easy to look back on anything any of us have ever done. And of course, when we do that, we don't make decisions that are perfect in the moment. We can't. We operate based on the exigencies and facts that occur right at that point. So can I look back and say what would have been done? Could he have basically created a scenario by which he had sat down nationally earlier on and answer anybody's questions, no matter how personal? Would that have changed the focus? Maybe, maybe not. The police didn't want that either because they didn't want the interview to be done in such a public fashion. Maybe that would have had an impact. I don't know. Could I have, done something to make the police or the family consider that the options were not just the guy that they had in their sights? I tried, so I don't know what I would have done in retrospect. Could the media have realized that, sometimes you get so far ahead of yourself that your tunnel vision turns out to be cause and effect as to what is counterproductive to both what you're trying to achieve, which is the truth, and an investigation? So I think the media can always look back and say, could we have done it better? And in terms of the police, I think they have the biggest explanation. How did you possibly put all the eggs in the basket of this investigation on one person to the exclusion of all else? So I don't know what we all could have done differently, but I'm sure we all could have performed better. And as I said, I think I'm a little disappointed that people don't know that I think there was some good lawyering done during this particular case. And I think that is something that I hold on to. And for me, I just would have done the communication strategy differently.
Maybe they'll know after they listen to this. Abbe, for the rising generation of lawyers who are lucky enough to stumble into crisis managers and investigators and executives who are lucky enough to stumble into a career involving a lot of high-profile, high-consequence matters, do you have some advice?
Look, I really do want this next sentences to be seen as sincere as they can be. I honestly believe that lawyers all over America are involved in the same kinds of cases you and I are talking about in the communities they live in. If you work for a public defender's office in a small town in America, and you start being assigned to represent somebody accused of murder somebody that is a well-respected person in the community, you're in a high-profile case, the stakes of which are high, and you need to figure out the law and the politics and the communications. If you are representing a company accused of putting a misbranded product on the market, you're in that kind of a situation. If you're representing one of these Chinese companies now that is at war with the Trump administration over whether they can do business in the United States, you may not be in a criminal case, and it might be a corporate deal, but you are in a high-profile case. I think the idea that a few of us in the criminal law end up as the only ones with high-profile, high-stakes cases don't really take into consideration what I just said. So I think the advice that I would give to lawyers is really a very basic set of steps. First and foremost, remember that we're being hired to be the lawyer. We've spent 3 years in law school and however many years in practice honing skills to do what lawyers do. First, you find the facts. How do you find the facts? You talk to people and you inspect documents and you do research into those things which are easier to do now in the internet stage. The second is you apply those facts to the law. You figure out what law applies. You do your job as a lawyer. And when you've done those two things, you can then branch out and take into consideration what are the ramifications in the other chessboards. What's the political ramifications? What's the marketplace ramifications? And what's the communications? You have to know with your client what the client's goal is. If you're the BP oil company and your offshore rig is spouting oil into the Gulf of Mexico, your first and foremost concern has to be to stop the oil. After that, it might be not to have your company go down the drain. And third might be, what am I going to do about the lawsuits? But you see what I'm saying? Each event requires you to be very in tune with your client's goals and priorities and not to apply one size fits all. But the ground on which we can stand to make sure that we always do the job that we were hired to do is to remember that our job is to be lawyers, and what are the lawyer skills? And then you can branch out to worry about those other ramifications. And I think nowadays we know that there are great communications consultants, there are great political consultants, there are great pollsters, there's great everything. Lawyers don't have to do it all. Now, of course, resources come into play. You may not be able to tap into those. And if that's the case, you may end up winging it and having to be the communications person or the political guru. But if possible, make sure you remember to stay in your lane.
Abbe Lowell, the man to see from Winston Strawn. Abbe, thank you very much for spending the morning with us.
Glad to do it.
What an interesting interview and an interesting opportunity to talk to someone who has been in the middle of so many high-profile crises and has spent so much time helping other people work through these crises. Michael, from just a media standpoint, can I ask you what struck you most about this?
I was most intrigued by Abbe's comments about the intense media focus on the alleged relationship versus its irrelevance to actually solving the case. Early on, Abbe talked about the legal and political and media chessboards, and this is what's unique about the media chessboard, and it's important for business leaders to keep this in mind. The news media's job is to cover the story behind the crisis. It's not to help you get your facts out. That's your job. And sometimes the most compelling news story is aligned with helping you get your facts out, but oftentimes it doesn't. So as a business leader or lead counsel or whatever role you have, your challenge becomes finding a way to communicate out all the salient facts that are important to you and doing it in a way that also helps a journalist do their job. And that's the art of effective crisis communications.
Shireen, what did you think?
I mean, I was thinking about, why did we do this podcast? It wasn't just to tell great stories, but to analyze how great leaders make decisions in crisis and hopefully provide our listeners with practical takeaways they can use to improve their own leadership abilities. With that in mind, one of Abbe's most impressive qualities is his ability to see the various layers of an issue before him. And problems so rarely exist in a vacuum and are almost never singular in nature. And when you go back to his chessboard analogy, he really eloquently describes how solving one problem may likely impact how another problem needs to be solved. He's able to see those different obstacles in his path and how they're intertwined with one another. This is often quite difficult to do when you're in the middle of a crisis. It's just a great reminder why it's good to have an expert on your team.
Well, I think we're at time, so we hope you, the listeners, have found this as interesting as we have, and that you'll join us next week on our next episode of Inside the War Room.
You've been listening to Inside the War Room, Case Studies in Crisis. Inside the War Room is produced by global communications firm BCW and global investigations firm Kroll. For more information about this episode, and to learn more about how you can work with BCW and Kroll to prepare, respond, and recover from a crisis affecting your organization, visit our website at itwrpodcast.com.